Hans took a step forward, then hesitated, and Greta could see the war happening inside him, the desperate hunger fighting against every warning she'd drilled into his head about strangers and soldiers and danger. The American soldier said something else, still in that gentle tone, and held the chocolate out further, an offering without demands. Hans's small hand reached out, pulled back, reached out again, trembling with the enormity of the decision. When his fingers finally closed around that chocolate bar, Greta saw tears start to track through the dirt on his face, cutting clean lines down his hollow cheeks. She should have stayed hidden, should have remained in the cellar where shadow and silence had kept them alive for months, but watching her son cry over a stranger's kindness broke something fundamental inside her. Greta found herself moving up the stairs, through the door, into the open air where American soldiers could see her clearly. Every survival instinct she'd developed screamed that this was suicide, that she was exposing herself and her children to whatever brutality these men had in store, but she couldn't let Hans face them alone. If they were going to die, they'd die together, standing in daylight instead of cowering in darkness. The young soldier who'd given Hans the chocolate looked up as she approached, and Greta watched his face carefully for signs of the cruelty she'd been promised. Instead, she saw surprise, then something that looked disturbingly like compassion. He said something in English that she didn't understand, then tried again in broken German, and she caught enough words to realize he was trying to reassure her, trying to tell her they were safe. The concept felt so alien she couldn't quite process it. Safe. When had any of them been safe? Hans pressed against her side, chocolate smeared across his mouth, joy radiating from him in a way she hadn't seen since before the war came to their doorstep. He babbled in rapid German about the kind soldier, about the chocolate, about how it tasted better than anything he'd ever eaten, and Greta stroked his hair while keeping her eyes on the Americans. The young soldier was pointing to himself and saying something that sounded like a name. Eddie. He repeated it several times until she understood. Eddie Kowalski. The surname sounded Polish, and something flickered in her memory about their neighbour before the war, the one who'd helped that Jewish family until they'd all been taken away in the night. Another soldier approached, older than Eddie, with stripes on his sleeve that probably meant authority. He moved with the same careful, non-threatening posture, hands visible, expression open. He said something in English to Eddie, then tried his own German, and Greta caught the word for food. Her stomach clenched at the question, at the implication that these enemy soldiers might feed them instead of shooting them. She wanted to refuse on principle, wanted to maintain some dignity in the face of her defeat, but Maria was still in the cellar, weak from malnutrition, and pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She heard herself explaining in halting German about Maria, about the smaller child still below, and watched Eddie's expression shift to something that looked almost like urgency. Without waiting for permission or protocol, he ladled something from their cooking pot into a metal container and held it out to her. Stew. Actual stew with meat and vegetables, not the watery turnip soup that had become their entire diet. Greta stared at it for a long moment, her internal war playing out in the seconds that stretched between offer and acceptance. If she took this food, she was acknowledging dependence on the enemy. If she refused it, Maria would continue to starve. Her hands shook so badly when she reached for the container that she almost dropped it, and the smell hit her with physical force, rich and complex, and so far beyond anything they'd eaten in months that it made her dizzy. She and Hans took turns with the spoon, small bites that they made last, savouring each mouthful like it might be their last real meal. The Americans watched them eat with expressions Greta couldn't quite interpret, something between sadness and satisfaction, and she wondered what they saw when they looked at her and her skeletal son. Probably the same thing she saw when she caught her reflection in broken glass. Ghosts. People who'd survived when survival itself seemed impossible. Days began to blend together in a way that felt almost dreamlike, so different from the nightmare of the previous months that Greta kept expecting to wake up back in the cellar, hungry and afraid. But each morning the Americans returned, and each morning Hans would emerge to greet them with growing confidence, his fear gradually replaced by something that looked dangerously like trust. The young soldier Eddie seemed particularly drawn to her son, spending time teaching him English words, sharing his rations, listening with genuine interest as Hans practiced his careful pronunciation. The change in Hans astonished her. The boy who'd stopped speaking entirely just weeks ago now chattered constantly in his mixture of German and broken English, bringing Eddie small treasures he'd found in the ruins. Smooth stones polished by rubble, a bent spoon he'd cleaned until it shone, wildflowers that somehow grew in the spaces between destruction. Eddie accepted each gift with the solemnity it deserved, treating Hans's offerings like they were precious instead of worthless debris. Greta watched these exchanges with a mixture of gratitude and terror, knowing that every connection her son formed with these Americans was another thread that would tear when they inevitably left. Even the other soldiers had softened toward them. The one called Flynn, who'd been hostile and suspicious at first, started setting aside portions of his own rations, pretending he wasn't hungry when everyone could see the gesture for what it was. The medic Patterson checked Maria's persistent cough without being asked, producing medicine from his supplies and explaining its use in careful, simple English. Rodriguez showed them pictures of his own children, pointing out how his daughter Rosa had the same serious expression as Maria, how his son Miguel reminded him of Hans. Eddie's letter from home arrived on a Thursday, and Greta happened to be nearby when he read it aloud to the other soldier called Martinez. She caught enough of the Polish mixed with English to understand the essence of his grandmother's message. The old woman wrote about feeding hungry people, regardless of their nationality, about resistance through kindness instead of violence, about choosing humanity when the world demanded hatred. Eddie's voice thickened with emotion as he translated, and Greta felt something crack open in her chest, some wall she'd built around her capacity for hope. She'd been practicing her English in secret, piecing together words from Hans's lessons, from the soldiers' conversations, from the fragments she remembered from before the war when languages still felt like bridges instead of barriers. The next day she approached Eddie with carefully prepared words, asking about his Polish family, and watched surprise and pleasure cross his face when she managed the question without too much stumbling. They discovered connections that seemed impossible and inevitable at the same time. His grandmother had fled Warsaw during the pogroms. Greta's neighbour had hidden a Jewish family with a similar surname. Their histories had intersected long before this moment in the ruins, threads of kindness and survival woven through decades of displacement and war. Greta found herself telling Eddie about Johann, about the husband who'd tried to desert and been killed for that choice by his own army. She'd never spoken about it before, afraid that the wrong person would hear and decide her family deserved punishment for Johann's supposed cowardice. But Eddie listened without judgment, without the condemnation she'd expected, and when he shared his own story of discrimination in America, of Polish immigrants facing hatred for their accents and their surnames, she understood they'd both lived in worlds that demanded they hate each other while sharing more in common than either nation wanted to admit. Maria spoke her first English word on a Tuesday afternoon, and it was chocolate, pronounced with such perfect clarity that both Greta and Eddie dissolved into laughter. Real laughter, the kind that came from joy instead of hysteria, the kind Greta hadn't allowed herself since 1943. The little girl beamed at their reaction, proud of herself, and repeated the words several times with increasing confidence. Greta watched her daughter's face light up with pleasure and felt the weight of 3 years of fear begin to lift, just slightly, just enough to imagine that maybe their future held more than survival. The routine they'd established felt almost normal by late April. Hans would wake early, eager to practice his English and share whatever treasure he'd found the day before. Eddie would be waiting with food and stories, teaching the boy phrases and listening to his excited chatter about everything and nothing. Maria would emerge later, still shy but warming gradually to the soldiers who treated her with gentle respect. And Greta would watch over them all, marveling at how quickly her children had learned to trust again, how resilient their capacity for hope proved to be, despite everything that should have crushed it. Eddie wrote letters home describing the good Germans he'd met, the families who reminded him that evil came from ideology and systems rather than from entire populations. He read passages aloud sometimes, and Greta heard herself and her children in his words, saw how he'd chosen to understand them as people first and enemies second. It should have felt like a small thing, that choice, but in a world that had spent years dehumanizing everyone on the other side of the conflict, it felt revolutionary. The future stretched before them with a possibility Greta hadn't dared imagine. Hans was learning to read English from Eddie's letters, sounding out words with determined concentration. Maria had started singing again, old lullabies Johann had taught her before he left, her voice thin but sweet in the cellar that had become less of a tomb and more of a temporary shelter. And Greta had begun to believe that perhaps not all soldiers were the same, that perhaps enemies could choose to stop being enemies when they remembered their shared humanity. The spring air carried the scent of growing things, life pushing through the debris of winter and war, and for brief stretches of time, Greta could almost forget the ruins surrounding them. Almost forget the bodies still buried in the rubble. Almost forget that their small community of reconciliation existed in the fragile space between one war ending and whatever came next. She should have known it couldn't last. She should have protected her heart and her children's hearts against the inevitable disappointment. But hope, once planted, grew with stubborn determination, and by the time she understood the danger, the roots had already spread too deep to easily tear out. The new commanding officer arrived on a Monday morning when the sky matched the grey of his pristine uniform, and Greta felt her stomach drop even though she didn't yet understand why. She watched from the cellar window as the soldiers scrambled to attention, saw Eddie's face change from relaxed contentment to rigid military formality, and knew with absolute certainty that their brief peace was ending. The officer looked young, too young for his authority, with the kind of bearing that suggested academy training and a need to prove himself through strict adherence to regulation. She couldn't hear the words from her distance, but she could read the body language clearly enough. The officer gestured toward the cooking area, where extra portions had been set aside for her family. He pointed to the small pile of Hans's gifts near Eddie's sleeping spot. He consulted a clipboard with the focus of someone who believed rules mattered more than the humans they affected. And with each gesture, each pointed reference, Greta watched the soldiers' shoulders slump incrementally, watched hope drain from their faces and be replaced by resigned compliance. Eddie's expression when he finally turned toward the cellar made her heart stop. He looked devastated, gutted, like someone who'd just received news of a death, and Greta understood before he could explain that he was being sent away. Of course he was. The kindness had been temporary, the compassion had been individual, and now the system was reasserting itself with the cold efficiency of military order. She gathered Hans and Maria and emerged from the cellar, expecting their usual morning exchange, refusing to show the new officer that his arrival had already broken something essential. Hans ran toward Eddie with his normal enthusiasm, carrying a flower he'd found growing between two chunks of broken concrete, and Greta watched the soldier's face crumple at the gesture. Eddie knelt down to the boy's level, accepting the flower with hands that shook slightly, and said something in English that made Hans's smile falter. The boy looked back at Greta with confusion, not quite understanding but sensing the change in atmosphere, the weight of adult decisions pressing down on their small world. It was the other soldier, Martinez, who finally approached to explain in his careful German that new regulations prohibited fraternization with German civilians. No more shared meals, no more English lessons, no more kindness that crossed enemy lines. And Eddie, the one who'd first offered chocolate and compassion, was being transferred immediately to convoy duty. He'd be leaving tomorrow morning at dawn, removed from temptation and from the people who reminded him that enemy was a political designation rather than a human category. Greta felt the walls slam back up inside her chest, all the defences she'd carefully dismantled over the past weeks reconstructing themselves with brutal efficiency. Of course this was happening. Of course the brief respite had been temporary. She'd been a fool to believe otherwise, a fool to let her children believe otherwise, and now they'd all pay the price for that foolishness in disappointment and renewed hunger. She looked at Eddie and saw not the kind young man who'd fed her son, but just another soldier in a long line of soldiers who made promises their orders wouldn't let them keep. That evening, Eddie came to the cellar carrying his last chocolate bar and a small sack of flour he'd somehow requisitioned, offerings that felt like apologies for crimes he hadn't committed. Hans accepted them with confused gratitude, not quite understanding why the soldier looked so sad, why his mother had gone silent and hard again. The boy said something in his careful English about how his mother had warned him that all soldiers eventually leave, that they all make promises they don't keep, and Greta heard her own bitter words reflected back at her through her son's innocent voice. She couldn't help herself, couldn't maintain the pretense that this was normal or acceptable or anything other than another betrayal in a lifetime of betrayals. When she stepped into the doorway and met Eddie's eyes, she spoke in English for the first time with him, using the words she'd practiced in secret, making sure he understood exactly what she thought of his departure. You leave like all soldiers leave. Orders matter more than people. We were foolish to hope. She saw him flinch at the words, saw him try to explain that he didn't want to go, that this wasn't his choice, but she'd heard too many excuses from too many men in uniform to care about the distinction between willing and ordered cruelty. She gathered her children and retreated into the cellar, closing the door with quiet finality, refusing to watch Eddie stand there with his useless gifts and his wounded expression. In the darkness, she held Hans as he cried, felt Maria trembling against her side, and hated herself for allowing them to trust, for teaching them that the world could be anything other than harsh and unforgiving. The chocolate wrapper Hans had treasured for weeks lay crumpled on the floor, and she wanted to burn it, to erase all evidence of their naive hope. But Hans snatched it up and pressed it to his chest like it could somehow protect him from the lesson he was learning about adult promises and childhood disappointments. The convoy left at dawn, and Hans stood at the cellar window watching it roll away into the grey morning light. The boy didn't wave goodbye, didn't call out, didn't cry. He just stood there with that terrible hollow expression, the one that said he was learning the world's cruelty was more reliable than its kindness, and Greta wanted to scream at the universe for teaching her son that lesson when he was only 8 years old and had already survived more than most adults would face in a lifetime. 3 weeks passed in silence that felt heavier than any bombardment. Hans stopped speaking again, reverting to the ghost child he'd been before Eddie's chocolate bar, before the brief window when laughter had seemed possible. He clutched that chocolate wrapper like a talisman, the only proof that their temporary reprieve had been real, and not some hallucination born of starvation and desperation. Maria stopped moving much, her small body conserving energy it didn't have, her cough growing worse without the medicine the American medic had provided. Greta stared at her children and calculated their remaining time in days rather than weeks. The food supplies Eddie and the others had shared were gone. The ration system had collapsed entirely. The cellar that had kept them safe from bombs now felt like a tomb where they were slowly dying of hunger and hopelessness. She'd failed them. Failed to keep them safe, failed to keep them fed, failed to protect them from the false promise that the world could be anything other than brutal to the weak and vulnerable. The decision crystallized in the hours before dawn when Maria's breathing sounded wrong, shallow and laboured, her small chest rattling with each inhale. They were going to die in this cellar, forgotten and alone, and at least if Greta surrendered them to the Americans, they might feed her children in whatever prison camp awaited German civilians. Prison rations were better than no rations. Survival in captivity was better than death in freedom. She'd trade anything, including their liberty, for the chance that Hans and Maria might live long enough to remember what it felt like to be full. She dressed them in their least ruined clothes, the ones she'd been saving for some imagined future when presentation might matter again. Her fingers trembled only slightly as she braided Maria's hair, worked out the tangles as gently as possible, tried to make her daughter look like a child deserving of compassion rather than a burden to be eliminated. Hans watched her preparations without comment, and that silence terrified her more than any protest would have. 8-year-olds should question their parents' plans, should fight against decisions they didn't understand, should have some spark of defiance left in them. His acceptance felt like defeat. The walk to the American checkpoint took them through streets transformed into moonscapes of rubble and ruin. Greta held Maria's hand on one side and Hans's on the other, picking their way carefully over debris that could hide anything from unexploded ordnance to unburied bodies. She'd practiced her speech in English, rehearsed the words that would trade her dignity for her children's survival. She would tell them she was seeking aid, that she had information to exchange for food, that she'd work in whatever capacity they required. Anything. She'd do anything to keep Hans and Maria from starving. The American checkpoint came into view, and Greta felt her throat close with fear and resignation combined. This was it. The moment when she surrendered the last shreds of their independence, when she admitted defeat not just to the Americans, but to the entire universe that had conspired to make their survival impossible. She opened her mouth to call out to the soldiers on duty to begin her carefully rehearsed plea, when a voice from behind stopped her completely. The voice was familiar and impossible, saying her name in English with that slight Polish accent, and she turned thinking she'd finally lost her mind entirely to hunger and stress. But Eddie Kowalski stood 20 feet away, looking older and more tired than when he'd left, carrying a canvas military bag and wearing an expression of such profound relief that she had to blink several times to confirm he was real and not some hallucination her desperate brain had conjured. He explained in his mixture of English and broken German that he'd received a letter from his grandmother, that he needed to read it to her, that it was important she understand what the old woman had written. Greta found herself nodding without quite comprehending, watching as Eddie unfolded thin paper with the care of someone handling something precious. Other American soldiers had begun to gather, drawn by whatever scene was unfolding, and she recognized some faces from before. Martinez, Flynn, Rodriguez, even the medic Patterson stood at the edge of the group. Eddie's voice carried across the checkpoint as he translated his grandmother's Polish words into English, and Greta's understanding of the language had improved enough over the weeks that she could follow most of it. The old woman wrote about feeding people like she'd been fed, about remembering humanity when the world demanded hatred, about putting children first always, and regardless of the uniforms their parents wore, or the flags their countries flew. She wrote about the German family who'd hidden her during the pogroms, about strangers who'd risked everything to feed a frightened Jewish girl, about how those acts of compassion had saved her life and defined her understanding of what it meant to be human. Martinez stepped forward and said something about regulations versus grandmother wisdom, about which carried more weight in the calculus of right and wrong, and other soldiers began nodding in agreement. Rodriguez pulled out a can of peaches. Flynn produced a chocolate bar with a sheepish expression that suggested he'd been hoarding it for weeks. Even soldiers Greta had never met started offering food, small gifts, quiet words of welcome that felt like absolution for sins she wasn't sure she'd committed. Eddie knelt down in front of Hans, bringing himself to the boy's eye level, and spoke directly to her son in a mixture of languages that somehow conveyed his meaning perfectly. He couldn't undo the orders or the leaving, couldn't change what had happened or erase the hurt his departure had caused, but he could tell Hans that some soldiers never forgot the children they'd fed, that feeding hungry people mattered more than following regulations that forgot children were human beings, regardless of their nationality or their parents' politics. The new officer appeared at the edge of the gathering, and Greta braced herself for the confrontation, for the reassertion of military order over human compassion. Lieutenant Blake stood with his clipboard conspicuously absent, his rigid posture softened somehow, and for a long moment he simply looked at Hans. Really looked at him, the way adults rarely look at children, seeing not just a German boy or an enemy civilian, but a child who deserved food and safety and some small measure of kindness in a world that had shown him mostly cruelty. Whatever Blake saw in that moment changed something fundamental in his expression, some calculation shifting from regulation to humanity, from the letter of the law to its spirit. He addressed Martinez in English that Greta couldn't fully follow, but the tone suggested permission rather than prohibition, authorization rather than punishment. Martinez translated with barely suppressed relief that they had surplus rations requiring distribution for humanitarian purposes, that feeding hungry civilians fell within acceptable parameters if properly documented and justified. Hans's fingers finally released the chocolate wrapper he'd clutched for 3 weeks, that precious scrap of evidence that kindness had existed once and might exist again, and he reached for the chocolate bar Flynn offered with trembling hands. The soldier ruffled his hair with rough affection, saying something in English about kids being kids no matter which side of the war they were born on, and Hans managed a smile that looked almost real, almost like the expression of a child who hadn't learned too early that the world broke promises more often than it kept them. Greta understood in that moment something that would reshape her entire understanding of humanity and conflict. The surprise wasn't that Americans could choose compassion. The surprise was that human beings, wearing whatever uniforms their governments issued, carrying whatever flags their nations demanded, could plant seeds of kindness in soil destroyed by hatred, and sometimes, if they tended those seeds with enough care and courage, something beautiful might still manage to grow. The war had taught her to expect cruelty, to prepare for betrayal, to build walls around her heart to protect it from the inevitable disappointments. But these soldiers, choosing to feed her children despite regulations and orders and all the systems designed to keep enemies apart, they taught her something the war couldn't destroy. That humanity persisted in the smallest gestures, that compassion could survive even in the ruins of ideology, and that sometimes the bravest act of resistance was simply feeding a hungry child without asking what flag their father died defending.